Hey there, Agile amigos. Welcome to the next episode of Agile Bytes, a podcast produced by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we are building software in an agile manner day in and day out. If no one has started a company or an organization called Agile Amigos, you totally ought to steal that. That sounds great to me. Today, I want to talk about a question, and maybe the word amigos is appropriate for today's discussion. This is a question that I've gotten at the last few workshops that I've done, and that is, who writes the user stories? So we know what user stories are for a lot of us in the Agile world. Our work items are user stories. They're what we kind of plan around. They're what go on the board. They're what we deliver. They're what we demonstrate. So who actually writes them? Should product owners write them? You know, if you're Scrum folks and you've got product owners, should your business analysts write them? Should your business analysts who found themselves accidentally becoming product owners write them? What about the dev team? Or what about the users? Should the users actually sit down and write their own user stories and then hand them to you? Should ChatGPT write your user stories? This is actually a discussion I've been in recently on LinkedIn. Can we just tell ChatGPT about our project and it can write the user stories for us? Well, before I answer the question directly, I'd like to deconstruct it a little bit, because I think that to even ask that question might open up the fact that we're already kind of coming at the issue from not the greatest place. Because the question, who writes the user stories, it sort of implies that user stories are created in the writing of them. But the content of the user stories does not come from writing user stories, weirdly enough. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say that you have some kind of regular team meeting. Maybe you have a daily stand-up or a daily scrum or a retrospective or something, but you've got some kind of meeting where you meet with your team members and you discuss issues of some kind. So you're getting ready to have this meeting, and then one of your team members says, hey, who's going to write the content for that meeting? Let's say it's your daily stand-up. Who's going to write the content for the daily stand-up tomorrow? And, you might rightly be a little confused by that question and say, you mean, what's our agenda? What's the topics we're discussing? No. I know what the agenda is. I just want to know who's going to write the content for it. Well, do you mean who's going to take the notes afterwards? No, I mean, when you're doing the actual meeting, who's going to write that stuff? Who's going to write the content for that? Well, that question almost doesn't make sense, does it? Because the content of, say, a daily stand-up or a retrospective isn't something that exists because you wrote it. It's something that happens when you have the meeting, right? You have the meeting, people say stuff. That's where the content comes from. Now, you may choose to write these things down for various reasons, mostly because they're probably actionable things, right? But you don't author the content of those meetings, and that's where the content comes from. Instead, you are recording the content of those meetings. At the risk of sounding like a Disney movie, the content is really inside of us all along, right? It's actually in our hearts. Those meetings facilitate that content being brought out. They facilitate that content being presented, and then we choose to write them down. So we record the content of those meetings, but we don't create the content. We don't author the content. So that's the first thing that I want to deal with. When we talk about who's writing the user stories, I want to deal right away with this misconception that user stories come from somebody authoring them. Okay, that's not the case. We record user stories, but we do not author user stories. That content comes from inside of people. And we may have an event to bring that content out. But the writing of the user stories is a recording activity. It is not an authoring activity. Okay, so let's say that we've decided that user stories are a recording activity. People have content inside of them. They are going to produce this content for us in the context of some kind of meeting probably, and we are going to record the things they say, and we're going to write user stories out of that content that's coming out of people. Well, then who does that, right? Who's responsible for that? Who are the parties responsible for making that magic happen? Well, again, I'd like to use a little bit of an analogy here. Let's say that we are going to write a book where we compile eyewitness accounts from the survivors of the September 11th attack on the Twin Towers in the United States of America in 2001. And so we want these firsthand eyewitness accounts. We want the people who were closest to the scene, closest to the action, people who saw the tragedy with their own eyes unfold. We want to take the things that they saw and we want to create a book or a movie or something out of that. Who should write those? Where should those accounts come from? Should I hire a bunch of experts on the September 11th attack and they write that content? Should I read a bunch of articles about September 11th and that's where my content is going to come from? Should I ask ChatGPT to provide me eyewitness accounts of surviving September 11th? Is that where my content should come from? Well, I hope that we would all agree that whatever people we might have involved in a production like this, the one group of people that probably needs to be there are the actual eyewitness survivors, right? That's where the content is going to come from. They are the ones who were on the front lines. They are the ones who saw with their own eyes the things that were happening. They were the people who were huddled in the buildings. They were the first responders to these events, people on the front line helping people out. That's who we want to hear from. It doesn't make sense for some party who wasn't there to be writing my eyewitness accounts of surviving 9/11, right? We want to get the people who are actually there, who are actually doing the stuff, who are there on the front lines. They need to be the center of the process. That's where the content is going to come from. Now, does that mean that I give each of these people a keyboard and tell them to write a chapter of a book? And then I just take whatever comes off their hands and slap it into a book and put it on Amazon? I could do that, and that would certainly be okay. That would accomplish my goal. I would have a book of eyewitness accounts of what it was like to live through September 11th. But what is more likely is that I would have people interviewing. They would be asking questions. They would be trying to draw different facets of the people's experience out. And sure, the people themselves would have a whole lot to say on their own, but then I might have a group of people to ask them questions that might even draw out things they haven't thought about in a while. Maybe things that people who didn't live through 9/11 might be very interested in knowing, and they might ask thought-provoking questions. They may dig deeper into some details, or they may come at it from angles that it didn't even occur to them to talk about, and it allows them to talk about their experiences in a way that they might not have even thought of themselves. So we might have somebody doing that. We might have somebody who's writing down all the raw accounts, but before we actually publish it, they're going to go through and clean it up a little bit, maybe make sure that the grammar is good, the words are spelled right. Maybe they might take some of the text for clarity and decide to leave certain things out or emphasize other things, or put it in a certain chronological order that might be slightly different than the sequence of the interview questions. Somebody to kind of arrange it into a narrative that a reader who might not have direct contact with those things could get a lot more out of than just maybe a raw, unfiltered conversation. Yeah, we might have people like that as well. Well, if you're thinking about this example, and this has made sense to you so far, that A, the one group of people we definitely need to hear from are the actual survivors, right? That's where most of this content is going to come from. And B, we might choose to supplement this process with people who can ask good, thought-provoking questions, and people who can take this raw content and put it in a format suited to our purposes. Well, you can probably see where this analogy is going, right? When we're writing user stories are stories that users tell us. That's where the content comes from. If you're writing user stories without talking to actual users, what are you doing? It would be like writing a book about surviving the September 11th attacks and not talking to anyone who actually survived the September 11th attacks. That makes no sense, right? I mean, I might come up with some pretty decent material perhaps, but it's not the same. I'm not going to get what I'm going to get from someone who was there. And that's the whole point of the exercise, right? I think that sometimes organizations have this idea that user stories are just the official Agile requirements format, TM, or they think, well, user stories are basically just wish lists of features, right? We're all going to sit around and brainstorm features that could go into this piece of software. And if that's the case, then yeah, I mean, you could use anything for that. You could use ChatGPT for that. You could use management for that. You could get all the developers in a room and just create those yourself. Yeah, you could actually do that. But user stories are not feature wish lists, and they are not a requirements format. User stories are stories that the users tell us about the business capabilities that they require so that we can provide those capabilities via software. And I said business capabilities. Obviously, depending on what you're building, it might not be strictly a business capability. It might be recreational. It might be some kind of utility or whatever. But you see what I mean? They're stories that people tell us about the things that they need so that we can deliver those capabilities via software and make them awesome at whatever those things are. And you can't get user stories without users and their stories. Like, I feel like this should be self-evident, right? But you need to have them. You need to have that raw material, and that's where most of your material is going to come from, are the users themselves. If you ask anybody else, even if you're asking software developers who know a lot about that business or that industry, or you ask managers of the department that you're building software for, or you go out on the street and begin to interview people about what they think ought to go. None of those things are replacements for the people who are on the ground, for the people who actually see this with their own eyes, that are on the front lines of these things that need to get done. There's no substitute for that, and you're trying to get their stories. Now, in this process, is it helpful to have people present who can ask good questions, who might be able to take the people who can provide this content and ask them thought-provoking questions, or have them explore certain things in more detail, or approach the problem from angles that the person themselves might not have even thought of? Maybe even help them innovate a little bit with some of these thought-provoking questions. Absolutely, 100%. There's absolutely room for business analysts and product owners and all the people we've talked about to be heavily involved, to ask those questions, to contribute to the conversation, to help bring out more and more of that content. Absolutely. Is it helpful to have somebody take this raw content and put it into a structure that's useful for the team to work from? Absolutely. Some organizations have a standardized user story format. I don't particularly, but even if you don't, usually you want your user stories to have certain characteristics, right? We want them to be the smallest deliverable unit of value. We want them to be as independent of each other as we can make them. We're going to have acceptance criteria. We're going to have tasks broken out from this. Can it be helpful to have somebody take the raw materials that users give us and put them in a structure that makes it easy to do those things? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's plenty of room for people to do that, and that can be very helpful for a team. But there is a huge difference between somebody asking questions and somebody structuring the stories and somebody actually creating those stories, right? Somebody actually inventing those stories off the top of their head. We actually don't want that. We want the stories to come from the users. That's where the witty name comes from. So I hope this has helped you as you think about who writes user stories and the process you're going to use to get them. I highly recommend that your user stories are stories that users tell you. And you may use other people and tools to help you ask good questions. I think, for instance, ChatGPT can be very thought-provoking when we talk about the industry. Ask it questions, see what it says. That might give us fuel for our own questions and our own brainstorming, perhaps. But it can't write your user stories for you. Only users can provide you the input you need to actually get those stories. And by all means, include people and tools and structures that help you explore that from as many angles as you need and get it into a format that's usable for your team. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.